In 1918, four of the greatest royal houses in Europe lost their thrones in the space of a single year. The Romanovs were shot in a cellar. The Ottomans were put on trains and told never to come back. The Hohenzollerns fled to a house in Holland and were never taken seriously again, and the Habsburgs, who lost the most of all of them, are still here. Not in a museum, not as a footnote in a history textbook. They are in parliaments, they are in embassies, they are in international law. One of them helped bring down the Iron Curtain. Another one races cars at Le Mans. The house that ruled Central Europe for roughly 640 years lost every single thing it owned in 1919. The crowns, the palaces, the estates, the right to even set foot on Austrian soil. And it did not disappear. It did not fade. It adapted. So how does that happen? How does a family lose an empire more completely than almost anyone in modern history and come out the other side more respected than the dynasties that lost less? And why is it that the two houses that fought hardest to keep their thrones, the Romanovs and the Hohenzollerns, are the two that ended in a cellar and a self-imposed exile, while the family that gave up its claim entirely is the one still walking the halls of Brussels? The truth about the Habsburgs isn't really a story about royalty. It's a story about survival, about knowing what to hold and what to let go of, and about a kind of long-term thinking that almost no institution on earth has ever managed. Stay with me, because the moment everything changed for this family is not the moment you'd expect. It isn't 1918, it's 1961. And I'll get to that. But first you have to understand where they came from, because nothing about the beginning suggested any of this. They did not start as emperors. That's the part people get wrong. When you hear the name Habsburg, you picture Vienna, you picture Franz Joseph in his white tunic with those enormous sideburns. But go back far enough, and the Habsburgs were nobody special. A family of counts in what is now Switzerland and southern Germany, holding a castle called Habsburg, the Hawk's Castle, and a handful of estates. There were dozens of families like them. Most of them are gone, and you have never heard their names. The turning point came in 1273, when Rudolf of Habsburg was elected king of the Romans. And here's the thing, he was chosen precisely because the great princes of the empire thought he was weak. They wanted somebody manageable, somebody who wouldn't threaten them. They picked the safe option. That's a mistake people make over and over again. In history, they underestimate the quiet one. They look at the man who isn't making noise, and they assume there's nothing there. Rudolf took that election and turned it into territory. He fought Ottokar of Bohemia. He won, and he handed Austria to his sons, and from that point forward, everything the Habsburgs did followed one principle that would define them for the next 6 centuries. Acquire quietly, hold permanently, and never ever risk the whole house on a single roll of the dice. There is a Latin line that has followed this family around for hundreds of years. It translates roughly as, "Let others wage war. You, fortunate Austria, marry." And it's not just a clever saying. It was policy, it was strategy, it was the single most effective piece of long-range planning any European family has ever executed. Look at what it bought them. Maximilian married Mary of Burgundy in 1477, and the wealthiest territory in northern Europe came with her. His son Philip married Joanna of Castile, and Spain came into the family, which means their grandson Charles V woke up one day as the ruler of Spain, the Low Countries, Austria, much of Italy, and the Spanish possessions in the Americas, an empire he had not conquered. He had inherited it. His grandfather won it with contracts and cathedrals, instead of cavalry. Now think about what that actually requires. It requires a family to be patient across generations, not across a reign, across generations. It requires a man to make a decision whose benefit he will never live to see, for a great-grandchild he will never meet. Most institutions cannot do that. Most companies cannot do that. Most governments cannot do that past the next election. The Habsburgs did it for 600 years, and it is the single trait that separates them from every other house that fell in 1918. But I want to be honest with you, because this is not a story where the family is always right. That strategy came with a bill attached, and eventually it came due. When you marry inside a narrow circle for that long, cousins to cousins, uncles to nieces, generation after generation to keep the inheritance from leaking out to rivals, biology sends you an invoice. The Spanish branch of the family paid it in full. Charles II of Spain, the last of that line, was chronically ill for his entire life and left no heir. When he died in 1700, the Spanish Habsburgs simply ended. Gone. The most powerful branch of the most powerful family in Europe, extinguished by the very system that had built it. And that should have been the end of the story, instead. And this is what makes them different. The Austrian branch watched their Spanish cousins die out and learned from it. That's the pattern I want you to hold on to, because it happens again and again with this family. They fail, they absorb the lesson, they change the rule, and they continue. Most dynasties fail and then double down on whatever caused the failure. 40 years later, they faced a crisis that should have finished them too. Emperor Charles VI had no son, just a daughter, Maria Theresa, and under the customs of the time, that was a death sentence for a dynasty. So he spent years doing something remarkable, negotiating, bribing, and cajoling the powers of Europe into signing a document accepting his daughter's right to inherit. He essentially spent his entire reign buying an insurance policy for his own family's future. When he died in 1740, half the signatories tore the policy up and invaded anyway. Prussia took Silesia, Bavaria, and France came for the rest. Maria Theresa was 23 years old and pregnant, and she was supposed to be finished. She was not finished. She held the empire together, she rebuilt the army, she reformed the tax system, the schools, the administration, and she ruled for 40 years. She lost Silesia and never got it back. And that is a real loss. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. But she kept the house. And she did it by marrying Francis Stephen of Lorraine, which is why the family that comes down to us today is properly called Habsburg-Lorraine, a house that survived by absorbing another house into itself rather than dying alone. Then came 1848, and this is where you really see the machinery working. Revolution swept across Europe. Thrones were shaking everywhere. In France, the king fell and never came back. In Austria, the Emperor Ferdinand was, by any reasonable measure, not capable of governing through a crisis of that magnitude. And the family did something that almost no monarchy of that era had the nerve to do. They did not defend him, they removed him. They put an 18-year-old on the throne instead, Franz Joseph, young, untainted by the previous decade, a fresh face the empire could rally around. The dynasty survived 1848 by sacrificing the man to save the institution. Think about how ruthless that is, and how clear-eyed. When the Romanovs faced their own version of this moment decades later, they did the opposite. They protected the man. They insulated Nicholas from every piece of bad news. They told him he was beloved, and they walked him straight into the abyss. The Habsburgs had already learned that no individual is bigger than the house, not even the emperor. Franz Joseph, then, reigned for 68 years, and in 1867 he made the other move that defines this family. Hungary was ungovernable. The empire had been beaten by Prussia and was bleeding legitimacy. So instead of crushing Hungarian nationalism, Franz Joseph split his own crown in half and created Austria-Hungary, 2 states, 2 parliaments, 1 monarch. He gave away half his authority in order to keep the other half. Every dynasty that fell in 1918 had a moment where it could have done that. Every single one. The Romanovs had 1905 and gave the Duma just enough power to be angry and not enough to be useful. The Ottomans had the constitutional movements and spent decades fighting them. The Habsburgs, whatever else you say about them, understood that sharing power is not the same as losing it. And still, with all of that wisdom, all of that patience, all of that institutional memory, they fell. Because there was one thing even they could not survive, and it arrived in the summer of 1914 in Sarajevo. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand set off the chain of events that ended the world these people had built. Franz Joseph died in November 1916, in the middle of the war, after 68 years on the throne, and the crown passed to his grandnephew, Charles, 29 years old, inheriting a war he had not started and could not win. He tried to end it. He made secret approaches toward a negotiated peace, and when they leaked, they humiliated him and bound him even tighter to Germany. He was a young man trying to steer a collapsing empire with almost no room to move. By November 1918, it was over. The empire was dissolving into successor states before anyone could sign anything. And on the 11th of November, Charles issued a declaration. And I want you to listen carefully to the wording here because everything that follows depends on it. He renounced participation in the affairs of state. He acknowledged whatever form of government the people chose. He did not abdicate. That is not a technicality. That is the hinge on which the next 100 years of this family turns. Wilhelm II of Germany abdicated and fled across the border into the Netherlands. Nicholas II abdicated for himself and then, catastrophically, for his son as well. Charles refused to sign away what he considered a sacred trust, and the new Austrian Republic understood exactly what that meant. It meant this man still considered himself emperor. It meant he might come back. So in April 1919, the Austrian Parliament passed what became known as the Habsburg Law. And it was total. The family was banished from the country. Their property, the estates, the art, the fortune accumulated over 6 centuries was seized, and any member of the house who wanted to come home had to formally renounce all claims to the throne and declare himself a loyal citizen of the Republic. Take a second with that. 640 years, and it was liquidated by an act of Parliament in a single afternoon. Charles did try to come back. Twice in 1921 he attempted to reclaim the Hungarian throne, Both attempts failed, the second one collapsing when the Hungarian regent, Admiral Horthy, a man who had served under him, refused to hand power back. The Allied powers had had enough. They put him on a British warship and exiled him to Madeira, an island in the Atlantic, with his wife Zeta and their children. They had almost no money. They lived in a cold, damp house up on a hillside, and in the spring of 1922 Charles caught a chill that turned into pneumonia. He died on the 1st of April 1922. He was 34 years old. Zeta was pregnant with their 8th child. That is where the story of most fallen dynasties ends. Bankrupt, banished, the head of the house dead in his 30s on an island 1,000 miles from home, with a pregnant widow and 7 children and no country that would take them. So why didn't it end there? Because of her. And this is the part of the story that almost nobody tells. Zeta of Bourbon Parma was 29 years old when she was widowed. She would live for another 67 years, and she wore black every single day of them. She never remarried. And in that time she did something that I would argue is the actual reason the Habsburgs exist today. She refused to let the family become ordinary. They had no money and no state, so she made the household itself into the institution. Her children were raised in exile, in Spain, in Belgium, with tutors and languages and history, and a very specific idea drilled into them, that the family's role was service, and that service did not require a throne. Her eldest son, Otto, was 9 years old when his father died. From that day, in his mother's eyes and in the eyes of the family's supporters, he was the head of the House of Habsburg. And Otto von Habsburg is where this entire story pays off, because here's what he did with an inheritance that consisted on paper of absolutely nothing. In the 1930s, as Hitler moved toward absorbing Austria, Otto became one of the loudest anti-Nazi voices in exile. He urged the Austrian chancellor to resist. He was so identified with opposition to the Anschluss that the German plan for the invasion of Austria was codenamed Operation Otto, named after him. Think about that, a young man in exile with no army, no throne, and no country, and the Third Reich named its invasion after him because he was the symbol they needed to erase. He was condemned, hunted, and had to run. He got out through France ahead of the German advance and eventually reached the United States, where he spent the war years lobbying Washington on behalf of Central Europe. He helped Austrians and Central European refugees get visas. He worked to have Austria treated as an occupied nation rather than a willing partner of Germany. And when the war ended, he came home to nothing. Austria was a republic. The Habsburg law was still on the books. He was still banned. Now here comes 1961, the year I told you about at the start, the year the family actually survived. After decades of refusing, Otto von Habsburg signed the declaration. He formally renounced all claims to the Austrian throne. He declared himself a loyal citizen of the Austrian Republic. To his supporters, it was surrender. To some monarchists, it was betrayal, the moment the House of Habsburg finally gave up. Even after he signed, the Austrian government fought him in the courts, and it took years of legal and political struggle before he was allowed to set foot in the country again in the mid-1960s. But look at what he actually understood, because it is the most sophisticated piece of thinking in this entire story. He grasped that the throne was worthless. Not symbolically worthless, practically worthless. There was no route back to it. Holding the claim bought the family nothing except permanent exile and permanent irrelevance. Meanwhile, the thing the claim was blocking, access to a country, a passport, a public life, a voice in the actual politics of Europe, was worth everything. So he traded the crown for a country. He gave up a title that existed only on paper to acquire a future that existed in the real world. Compare that to the Hohenzollerns, Wilhelm II, a house in the Netherlands until his death in 1941, still surrounded by the trappings of a court, still being addressed as Majesty, still waiting for a restoration that was never, ever coming, while members of his family drifted toward the Nazi Party in the hope that it might be the vehicle that gave them back the throne. They kept the claim. They lost the reputation, and a century later they are still in and out of German courtrooms arguing over property. Compare it to the Romanovs, who kept the claim right up until there was nobody left alive to make it. Compare it to the Ottomans, expelled from Turkey by law in 1924, stripped of citizenship, scattered across the Middle East and Europe. Some of them fell into genuine poverty. It took until the 1950s for the women of the house to be allowed back into the country, and until the 1970s for the men. 2 generations of a 600-year-old imperial family spent essentially waiting for a phone call that never came. Otto didn't wait. He got elected. In 1979, the man who had been born heir to an empire ran for the European Parliament as a candidate for a Bavarian party in Germany, and he won. He served for 20 years, 2 decades of committee work, votes, position papers, debates. He was president of the International Pan-European Union for over 30 years. He spent his career arguing, long before it was fashionable, that the nations of Central and Eastern Europe were not lost, that they were European, that they belonged in the European project, and that the Iron Curtain was temporary. Nobody believed him for most of that time. People thought it was nostalgia, an old imperial dreaming out loud about a map that no longer existed. And then came the summer of 1989. In August of that year, a group of Hungarian reformers and pan-European activists organized a symbolic event on the Hungarian-Austrian border near Sopron. They called it the Pan-European Picnic. The idea was to briefly open an old border crossing as a gesture of friendship. Otto von Habsburg was one of its patrons. His daughter attended in his place. What happened was not symbolic at all. Word had spread among East Germans holidaying in Hungary. When that gate opened, hundreds of them ran through it, the largest escape from the Eastern Bloc since the Berlin Wall went up. And the Hungarian border guards, facing a decision that could have turned into a massacre, stood aside. The wall came down that November. Now, I want to be careful here, because history is never one man. The fall of communism had 1,000 authors, and Otto von Habsburg was one of many. But the fact remains, the son of the last emperor of Austria, the boy whose father died broke on an island in the Atlantic, the man whose family had been legislated out of existence in 1919, was standing at the border of the empire his family had lost, helping to open a gate that helped end the division of Europe. 70 years after the Habsburgs were declared finished, a Habsburg was one of the people present at the moment Central Europe came back together. And there is one more scene, earlier that same year, that I think closes the loop better than anything. Zeta, the widow in black, the woman who had held this family together from a rented house in exile, had finally been allowed to return to Austria in 1982, after 60 years away. She died in March 1989 at the age of 96. The Republic of Austria, which had banished her, permitted her funeral in Vienna. Thousands of people lined the streets. The last empress of Austria was carried through the capital and taken to the imperial crypt beneath the Capuchin church, where her husband's family had been buried for centuries, and at that door they performed the ritual the Habsburgs have used for hundreds of years. The herald knocks. A voice from inside asks who desires entry. The herald recites the full titles: Empress, Queen of Hungary, Queen of Bohemia, all of it, and the voice answers, "I do not know her." He knocks again. He recites her honors and her achievements. The voice answers again, "I do not know her." He knocks a third time, and this time he says only that she is a mortal, sinful human being. And the door opens. That ceremony is the whole philosophy of this family compressed into 90 seconds. Strip away the titles, strip away the empire, strip away the claim. What is left underneath is what actually gets you through the door. Otto himself died in July 2011 at 98 years old. He was given the same ritual and the same knock and the same 3 answers. He was buried in Vienna, and his heart was interred separately in an abbey in Hungary. A final gesture toward the 2 halves of the empire his great-uncle had joined together in 1867. The family did not stop there. His son Karl leads the house today, served in the European Parliament himself in the 1990s, and has spent years working on the protection of cultural heritage in war zones through Blue Shield International, which, when you think about it, is exactly what a family that lost everything to war would decide to spend its time on. Another Habsburg serves as Hungary's ambassador to the Holy See. Another one is a professional racing driver who has competed at Le Mans. Charles, the last emperor, the man who died at 34 on Madeira with nothing, was beatified by Pope John Paul II in 2004, largely on the strength of his attempts to end the First World War. They have no throne, they will not get one, and that was the point. So let me bring this all the way back to the question I started with, because I think the answer is genuinely useful and not just to people interested in dead empires. The Romanovs died because they could not imagine being anything other than autocrats. The Hohenzollerns faded because they spent a century waiting to be restored instead of building something new. The Ottomans were scattered because their identity was fused to a state and a caliphate that were both abolished at once. In every case, the family had defined itself by the thing it could no longer have. The Habsburgs survived because they were never really a throne. They were a set of habits, patience across generations, a willingness to trade a piece to keep the whole, an absolute refusal to let one man's pride outweigh the family's future, and the ability to look at something they had held for 600 years and admit that it was gone. That's a hard thing to do. It might be the hardest thing there is. Most people, most families, most institutions would rather be right about the past than useful in the present. I don't want to romanticize them. This was a family that ruled millions of people who never chose them, that held on to power for centuries with all the coercion that implies, that let a diplomatic crisis in 1914 become a war that killed millions, and that paid for its marriage strategy with the suffering of its own children. All of that is true, and none of it should be softened. But if you're asking why they're still here when the others aren't, the answer isn't luck, and it isn't divine right. It's that at the exact moment when holding on would have destroyed them, they let go and discovered that the name had always been worth more than the crown. 640 years of rule. 100 years of exile. And they are still in the room. That, in the end, is what survival actually looks like.